Today we are going to explore a fascinating period of human history, diving into the humble kitchens and smoky fireplaces of medieval Europe to discover how our ancestors survived through food. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. Imagine for a moment a world without supermarkets, without refrigerators, without food delivery apps. A world where the line between life and death could be as thin as the next harvest or as thick as the snow that covered the fields during endless months of winter. This was the medieval world, and the people who lived in it developed an extraordinary culinary wisdom that deserves to be rediscovered. We are not talking about luxurious banquets served in castles or the delicacies that adorned the tables of kings. We are talking about something much more fundamental, about recipes that were born from the pure and simple necessity to survive, recipes that were perfected over generations, passed down from mother to daughter, from father to son, in an uninterrupted chain of practical knowledge that spanned centuries. The medieval period, which stretched approximately from the 5th century to the 15th century, was a time of extreme contrasts. On one side, there was the opulence of feudal lords, with their elaborate feasts and spices imported from distant lands. On the other, there existed the vast majority of the population, the peasants and workers who constituted the backbone of society and who needed to feed their families with extremely limited resources. It was precisely these common people who developed some of the most ingenious culinary techniques in history, techniques that not only kept bodies fed, but also maximized every gram of nutrition available in often scarce ingredients. The sun had not yet fully risen when the first embers were revived in the fireplaces of peasant houses in medieval England. The cold dawn air was cut only by the sound of pots being moved and the gentle bubbling of a thick liquid over the fire. This was the sound of pottage, the dish that perhaps more than any other defined the medieval diet. To understand the importance of this simple stew, we first need to understand the daily reality of those who depended on it. A typical peasant family lived in a single-room house, often sharing the space with their animals during the coldest months. In the center of this environment stood the fireplace, not only a source of heat, but also the culinary heart of the home. It was there, over the flames that were never completely extinguished, that the iron or clay cauldron hung, where the pottage cooked slowly, day after day. The beauty of pottage lay precisely in its simplicity and adaptability. There was no fixed recipe to be followed. There was no list of ingredients that needed to be respected. Pottage was, in its essence, the art of transforming anything available into sustenance. Barley, oats, peas, beans, turnips, leeks, and if luck smiled, a small piece of meat or fat. Everything went into the cauldron. Everything was transformed into food. The logic was relentless. The longer it cooked, the better it became. Families kept their cauldrons of pottage simmering for days, sometimes weeks, simply adding new ingredients as they became available. It was essentially an endless soup, a gift that kept on giving as long as there was something to add to the pot. What may seem primitive to modern eyes was in fact nutritionally sophisticated. Prolonged cooking broke down the tough fibers of vegetables and grains, making them easier to digest and releasing more nutrients. Contemporary studies demonstrate that this humble peasant dish was, paradoxically, healthier than many of the elaborate meals consumed by the nobility. Feudal lords might have their feasts with roasted meats and sauces rich in spices, but their bodies often paid the price of unbalanced diets. Peasants, with their pottage of vegetables and grains, received a more balanced combination of nutrients. Historical records from medieval England suggest that more than 70% of peasant meals included some form of pottage. It was not just food, it was a daily ritual, an anchor of stability in lives often marked by uncertainty. The consistency of the dish varied according to the available ingredients. In some regions, the pottage was so thick that a spoon could stand upright in the center of the cauldron. In others, it was more liquid. More fortunate families could add pieces of bacon, elevating the flavor and nutritional value. The less fortunate relied only on vegetables and grains, but even so they managed to extract sustenance to face days of work in the fields. The oldest culinary manuscript in the English language, the form of Cury from the 14th century, contains several recipes for pottage. This demonstrates that, although the dish was associated with the poor, it also found its place in royal kitchens, albeit in more elaborate versions. The monastic recipe books from St. Edmund's Abbey and Durham Priory show that even lay brothers and servants ate meals similar to those of peasants, thick stews of vegetables and peas, seasoned with salt, herbs, or a trace of fat. But if pottage kept bodies fed during the months when vegetables were available, what happened when the fields were covered in snow and the barns began to empty? The answer to this question leads us to another pillar of medieval food: food preservation techniques. In an era before refrigeration, preserving food was literally a matter of life or death, and few foods exemplify this art of preservation better than pickled herring. Herring was an abundant fish in the cold waters of the North Sea, caught by the thousands by fishermen who braved the icy waves. But the abundance of one day could mean waste the next, unless there was a way to preserve the catch. It was this necessity that led to the development of preservation techniques that would transform the diet and economy of entire regions of Europe. The Dutch, in particular, became masters in the art of preserving herring. At the end of the 14th century, a revolutionary method emerged, traditionally attributed to a fisherman from Biervliet named Willem Boykelzoon, although modern historians suggest that similar techniques already existed in Scandinavia previously. The process, known as kaken or gibbing, involved the careful removal of the fish's viscera, leaving the pancreas and certain parts of the stomach intact. The enzymes released by these organs, particularly trypsin, initiated a controlled fermentation process while the fish was immersed in brine. The result was a product that could last for months, even years, without deteriorating. This innovation had consequences that transcended simple food preservation. Pickled herring became a commodity so valuable that wars were fought over fishing rights. Dutch and Flemish fishermen could venture into more distant waters, knowing that their catch would be preserved on board even during journeys of weeks. For common people, pickled herring represented a reliable source of protein during the long winter months. The flavor was intense, salty, acidic, and distinctly fishy. The aroma was equally memorable. Walking through a medieval fish market was a sensory experience that few would forget. But for those who depended on this food to survive, the strong flavor was not a defect. It was a virtue that made simple bread or potatoes much more interesting. It was the difference between a monotonous meal and a meal that satisfied. The church also played an important role in the popularization of pickled herring. During Lent and other fasting periods, when the consumption of meat was prohibited, fish became essential. Preserved herring, cheap and widely available, allowed even the poorest families to fulfill religious obligations without going hungry. It was a food that crossed class barriers, appearing both on monastery tables and in peasant huts. If pickled herring demonstrates medieval ingenuity in fish preservation, pickled walnuts show that this same creativity extended to the plant kingdom. Nowadays, when we think of walnuts, we imagine the dried fruits with their hard brown shells that we know. But medieval cooks discovered that walnuts harvested, while still green and soft before the shell completely formed, could be transformed into something completely different through pickling in spiced vinegar. The process began with the careful harvesting of the walnuts at the exact moment when they were still tender enough to be pierced by a needle. These green walnuts were then immersed in brine for several days, a process that extracted part of their natural bitterness. Next, they were transferred to jars of vinegar seasoned with cloves, mace, and pepper. There they would remain for weeks or months, absorbing the flavors of the spices while transforming into something unique. The final result was small black tender spheres with a flavor that combined acidity, subtle bitterness, and a texture unlike anything else in the medieval pantry. What makes pickled walnuts particularly interesting from a historical perspective is how they crossed social barriers. For wealthy landowners, they were a refined delicacy, an elegant complement to meats and cheeses. For peasants, they represented an ingenious way to take advantage of the walnuts that fell on common lands, transforming them into a food that would last for years. A 15th century English household management book warned that wasting food was mocking divine abundance. Pickled walnuts were the practical response to this moral and practical imperative. As we explore the medieval pantry, we find another element that surprises by its simplicity and importance: honey. In a world where refined sugar was an extreme luxury, imported from distant lands and accessible only to the wealthiest, honey played a fundamental role as a sweetener. And it was with honey that cakes were made that brought sweetness to the lives of people who knew few other luxuries. Medieval honey cakes were modest creations compared to the elaborate confectionaries we would come to know centuries later. Flour, honey, and occasionally spices like cinnamon or nutmeg were the only ingredients. There was no chemical leavening to make the dough rise, no refined sugar to sweeten. The resulting texture was dense and compact, very different from the fluffy cakes we know today. But for medieval palates, accustomed to the absence of sweets, these simple cakes were true treasures. Bakers prepared the dough by mixing sticky honey with flour, shaping the result into small round portions that were then baked in communal ovens or steamed over boiling water. The secret ingredient was no exotic spice, but simply time. Honey cakes improved with age, developing deeper flavors as the days passed. Experienced bakers prepared batches in advance, knowing that celebrations would be sweeter with cakes that had matured properly. Unlike modern cakes that become hard quickly, these dense treats remained edible for weeks. This durability was not just convenient, it was essential in an era where one could not simply go to a bakery to buy a fresh cake when the occasion demanded. Honey cakes appeared at weddings, symbolizing vows of a sweet life together, and also at funerals, offering the bereaved something sweet to counterbalance the bitterness of loss. For the average peasant family, a honey cake represented a rare moment of indulgence. A child might receive one on their patron saint's day, or after the completion of the harvest. The flavor was not overly sweet like modern candies. There was a subtle complexity that came from the raw honey, which carried the aromas of whatever flowers the bees had visited. Some believed these cakes possessed magical properties. The only true magic, however, was how quickly they disappeared when no one was looking. The medieval mentality regarding food was deeply marked by the horror of waste. In a world where the next meal was never guaranteed, every crumb had value. This philosophy found its most eloquent expression in the treatment given to bread. Bread was sacred in medieval culture, the sustenance of life. Wasting it was not just frowned upon. In some villages, it was actually punishable. Records from a small town in France show a baker who was fined and publicly shamed for throwing away unsold loaves instead of donating them to the poor, or transforming them into porridge. The average medieval peasant consumed up to a kilo of bread every day, making bread porridge less of a creative recipe and more of an essential damage control for their main food group. When bread became hard, which happened quickly in the absence of preservatives, panata or bread porridge came onto the scene. The cook would tear the hardened bread into pieces and let it cook in broth until it broke down into a thick and smooth paste. Herbs from the garden, a bit of fat, perhaps an egg if available, and dinner was served. The flexibility of this preparation was remarkable. Recipes from the royal court show sophisticated versions with saffron, almond milk, and sugar. Meanwhile, in the villages, humble recipes used any available broth, often seasoned with herbs gathered in the wild or vegetables from the garden. The final texture was smooth and silky, not much different from modern risotto, but made entirely with ingredients that would otherwise go to waste. Medieval bread porridge had the incredible ability to stretch a kitchen's resources in a way that would make a modern budget cookbook author cry with joy. Just as bread found new life in porridge, eggs found expression in the herb pies that fed countless medieval families with minimal ingredients and maximum flavor. These small pies were a primitive version of what we today call quiche, just eggs, garden herbs, and sometimes a bit of cheese if available. Medieval cooks created a basic dough of flour and water, pressed it into shallow molds, and filled it with beaten eggs mixed with whatever green herbs were growing nearby. The genius of these pies lay in their seasonal adaptability. Spring pies might feature wild garlic and young nettles, while summer versions overflowed with parsley, sage, and thyme. Any leftovers from the previous day, a bit of fish, some roasted turnips, the last bits of bacon, could find their way into these versatile dishes. Baking took place directly in the hot ashes of the fire or in small iron pans nestled among the embers. No sophisticated temperature controls, no kitchen timers. Medieval cooks judged the point by sight, smell, and hard-earned experience. These pies were essentially the original portable meal, medieval fast food without the drive-through window. Women prepared these pies in the morning, before work in the field began, and wrapped them in cloth for midday meals. Men working far from home unwrapped these substantial treats hours later, getting a much-needed protein boost to face the afternoon's labor. Records from a manor house in Yorkshire show that its kitchen prepared more than 100 herb pies per week for workers during the harvest season, proving how important these simple egg dishes were to keeping medieval workforces fed. The vegetable world offered other combinations that sustained bodies through the harshest winters. The humble mixture of mashed beans and leeks may not sound exciting to modern ears, but in medieval times, this dish was a nutritional powerhouse that kept bodies strong through the toughest winters. Fava beans, plump legumes rich in protein, formed the base of this staple food. The beans were soaked overnight, boiled until tender, and then mashed with a wooden pestle until smooth. Leeks, those mild relatives of the onion that grow even in poor soil, were chopped and gently cooked in any available fat, often just a scraping of lard or a bit of olive oil in Mediterranean regions. When combined, these simple ingredients created a satisfying meal that offered serious endurance. Medieval farmers could not take lunch breaks every few hours. They needed food that would sustain them from dawn to dusk. This mixture of beans and leeks did exactly that. What made this combination truly special was its availability to almost everyone. Beans could be dried and stored for years, while leeks were among the hardiest vegetables in the medieval garden, surviving even when other crops failed. Beans were so valuable that in parts of medieval France, tenants could pay their rent with bags of dried fava beans instead of coins. The nutritional value of this simple dish was remarkable. Modern analyses show that one serving provided nearly half of the daily protein needed for an active adult, plus essential vitamins and minerals that were lacking in most medieval diets. Beans were so important that many villages maintained common bean fields where each family could grow its own crop. Records from a 14th century English manor show that even during years of famine, the bean fields were carefully cultivated and protected. When night fell over medieval villages and the day's work finally came to an end, there were moments of small comforts that awaited those who returned to their humble abodes. One of these comforts came in the form of a curious drink that blurred the lines between beverage, medicine, and dessert. Take a sip of posset and step back in time. This curious mixture was prepared by heating milk and then adding wine or ale to curdle it. The mixture was typically sweetened with honey and seasoned with whatever was available: cinnamon, nutmeg, or ginger. The result was a thick, warm drink with soft curds floating in a sweet and acidic liquid. Posset gained popularity across all social classes for different reasons. The wealthy enjoyed elaborate versions in special posset cups with spouts to sip the liquid while capturing the curds with small spoons. Meanwhile, common families valued it for its ability to use up leftover ale before it spoiled. Sweet, acidic, strangely comforting posset was like the unpredictable cousin of warm yogurt that appeared at every family gathering, invited or not. The flavor varied widely depending on the quality of the ingredients, but most people found it soothing and satisfying. Beyond its culinary appeal, posset had a reputation as a cure-all. Medieval healers prescribed it for everything from the common cold to digestive problems. Medical texts from the 15th century recommend posset made with sage to treat fever and with rosemary to clear the mind. It was served in taverns as a nightcap, claiming it promoted good sleep and prevented hangovers. Although drinking more alcohol to prevent a hangover seems like flawed medieval logic. The tradition of posset remained popular for centuries, eventually evolving into the syllabubs and custards we know today. For those who traveled or worked far from home, there were other culinary solutions that solved the medieval lunch dilemma, long before plastic containers and Sunday meal prep sessions existed. Meat pasties contained a filling of minced meat, root vegetables, and herbs, all wrapped in a sturdy pastry shell. The dough was not just a container, but a preservation method. Sealing the filling from the air kept it fresh for longer. Contrary to popular belief, pasties were not just for the rich. Common people made theirs with whatever leftovers were available: a bit of remaining pork, turnips, onions, and perhaps some dried herbs. Medieval workers relied heavily on these convenient meals. Cornish miners became especially famous for their pasties, which they took into the depths of the mines. The thick, crimped edge of the crust served as a handle that could be held with dirty hands and then discarded. This edible lunchbox was the medieval equivalent of those smug office workers with their matching glass containers, except the miners were worried about the mine shaft collapsing instead of Instagram likes. The pasty played such a vital role in medieval life that it appears in household records throughout Europe. An account from a manor in 1300 shows that during the harvest season, a single kitchen produced more than 200 pasties in a week to feed the field workers. When even meat was scarce, medieval kitchens turned to another low-cost option that offered impressive flavor with minimal ingredients. Forget fancy soup stocks. Onion broth fed medieval Europe with minimal fuss and maximum flavor. In its most basic form, this kitchen staple consisted of thinly sliced onions cooked in water with a pinch of salt. Wealthier families might add a marrow bone or herbs, but even the simplest version provided remarkable sustenance and flavor. Onions were among the easiest vegetables to grow and store in medieval times. Their long shelf life made them precious during the winter months when fresh food was scarce. A single bag of onions could keep a family in broth for weeks when other options ran out. Medieval doctors valued onion broth for its supposed healing properties. Texts from the 15th century recommend it for treating coughs, reducing fever, and relieving joint pain. The biggest drawback was that medieval kitchens turned into tear gas chambers during preparation. With no ventilation beyond smoky chimneys, cooks probably spent half their time looking like they just watched a tragic play unfold. While onion broth made the most of vegetables, another medieval specialty proved that no part of an animal needed to be wasted. Waste not, want not reached its peak with medieval offal pies. These substantial dishes contained all the animal parts that modern shoppers avoid. Liver, heart, kidneys, lungs, and other organs mixed with herbs and encased in a rustic pastry crust. Although it might make some modern diners squirm, these pies were practical, nutritious, and surprisingly tasty. When an animal was slaughtered in a medieval village, nothing went to waste. Meat was expensive, so common people made clever use of every part. Organs were, in fact, some of the most nutrient-dense parts of the animal, rich in iron, vitamins, and protein. These nutritional powerhouses kept people healthy during harsh winters when fresh food was scarce. Preparing an offal pie required skill. The organs needed careful cleaning and often pre-cooking before being chopped and seasoned with herbs, salt, and sometimes dried fruits or nuts to balance the strong flavors. The mixture was then wrapped in dough and baked until golden. In 13th century London, records show that more than 30% of slaughtered animals were utilized entirely, organs and all. Butchers separated offal specifically for pies and sausages, which became affordable sources of protein for common people. These pies were so common that medieval doctors actually recommended them for specific ailments. Feeling weak? Eat heart pie. Trouble breathing? Try some lung pie. Having memory problems? Brain pie might help. While some preferred their animal parts hidden in pies, others enjoyed a more refined approach to humble ingredients. How did medieval people enjoy cheese before pizza existed? The cheese and herb pie was the answer. Fresh curd cheese mixed with eggs and garden herbs in a simple flour crust. Unlike everyday meat pies, cheese pies were special treats made only when milk was abundant in spring and summer. Medieval culinary manuscripts show that these pies varied across Europe, with southern versions using olive oil and Mediterranean herbs, while northern recipes featured butter and chives. For breakfast on busy workdays, medieval people needed something quicker that could be prepared in advance. The medieval breakfast was all about oatcakes, the ultimate fast food when you needed to eat quickly before a hard day's work. These rustic tortillas were made from ground oats mixed with water and a pinch of salt, then cooked on hot stones beside the fire or on simple iron griddles. Unlike modern fluffy pancakes, these were thin, substantial discs designed to fill bellies and provide lasting energy. Oats grew where other grains failed, making them a lifesaver in northern regions with poor soil and wet weather. Scottish and Irish communities particularly relied on oatcakes as daily staples. These were not the Instagram-worthy stacks, drenched in maple syrup we know today. They were the no-nonsense workout fuel of the medieval world. Pancakes became especially important during Lent, when fasting rules demanded creative cooking. Pre-Lenten pancakes used up forbidden ingredients like eggs and fats before the 40 days of fasting began. After a long day of medieval labor, nothing hit the spot like spiced wine, or hippocras as it was commonly called. This warming drink took ordinary wine and transformed it into something special by simmering it with cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and sometimes honey. The spices masked the flavor of cheaper wines, allowing even modest families to enjoy a luxury-tasting drink. Medieval doctors claimed that hippocras aided digestion, which conveniently gave people an excuse to enjoy it after heavy meals. Medical texts from the 14th century prescribed it for everything from stomach problems to finding a suitable husband. Serving hippocras at the end of a meal was the medieval version of, "I deserve this after eating bland pottage for days." A spiced drink felt like a reward for simply surviving another week without the plague. Speaking of warm comfort, medieval bakers knew that adding a special ingredient to bread could make it extraordinary. Dark beer bread transformed a daily necessity into something special by using ale instead of water in the dough. This clever substitution resulted in a moister bread with better rise and a slightly acidic flavor that medieval people found irresistible. The natural yeasts and sugars in the beer helped the bread rise more effectively than plain water, creating a fluffier texture. Medieval bakers discovered this technique out of practicality. Ale was often safer to drink than water in cities and towns where water sources were contaminated. Cooking killed any harmful bacteria, making beer bread both delicious and sensible. Yeast in medieval times was wild and unpredictable, literally harvested from the air or recycled from beer brewing. Beer bread was like having a backup plan when your usual yeast was feeling lazy or had taken the day off entirely. As our journey through medieval kitchens comes to an end, we are reminded that these recipes were much more than simple instructions for preparing food. They were survival strategies refined over generations, knowledge passed from mouth to ear, from hand to hand. They represented the collective wisdom of entire communities that learned to extract sustenance from the most limited resources. The pottage that simmered eternally over the hearth, the herring that crossed the winter without spoiling, the honey that transformed simple flour into celebration. Each of these elements told a story of adaptation, of creativity, born of necessity. Perhaps the most profound lesson we can draw from these ancient culinary practices is one about valuation. In a world where we waste approximately 1/3 of all food produced, the medieval people remind us that every food item has potential. Yesterday's hard bread was not trash, it was the beginning of tomorrow's porridge. The organs we discard were nutritional treasures. The green walnuts we ignore could be transformed into preserves that lasted for years. These recipes also tell us stories about community. Pottage was not just food, it was the daily ritual that gathered families around the hearth. Oatcakes were not just breakfast, they were the fuel that allowed entire days of collective work in the fields. Herb pies were not just lunch, they were demonstrations of care prepared in the early hours of the morning to be shared at midday. And perhaps most importantly, these recipes speak of resilience. The people who created them faced challenges we can barely imagine. Winters without central heating, summers without harvest guarantees, diseases without antibiotics. And yet, they found ways not only to survive but to create moments of pleasure and celebration, even in the most difficult circumstances. A honey cake on a feast day, a glass of hippocras after a hard week, a warm posset to cure a cold, or simply to bring comfort on a cold night. Medieval culinary knowledge represents a heritage that deserves to be preserved and studied. Not because we should abandon the comforts of modern life, but because there is wisdom in these ancient practices that remains relevant. The art of making much with little, of wasting nothing, of finding satisfaction in simplicity. These are lessons that our modern societies, with all their abundance and technology, would do well to relearn. When we look back across the centuries to those humble kitchens with their smoky fireplaces and bubbling cauldrons, we do not see just primitive culinary techniques. We see human ingenuity in its purest form. We see our species' capacity to adapt, to innovate, to transform challenges into solutions. And we see, above all, the power of food, not just as physical sustenance, but as a central element of the human experience, capable of creating connections, marking celebrations, and bringing comfort even in the most difficult moments. The recipes we explored in this documentary are more than historical curiosities. They are testimonies to an era in which the relationship between human beings and their food was much more intimate and conscious than we tend to have today. An era in which every meal was appreciated because nothing was guaranteed, in which every ingredient was valued because nothing could be wasted. Perhaps by reflecting on these ancestral practices, we can find inspiration for a healthier and more sustainable relationship with food in our own lives. The history of medieval food does not end here. There is much more to be discovered, explored, and shared. If you enjoyed this journey through time and wish to continue learning about the fascinating, forgotten chapters of human history, consider subscribing to our channel. Each subscription allows us to continue researching and producing content that rescues valuable knowledge from the past. Leave your comment telling us which medieval recipe most sparked your curiosity, or if you have already tried to prepare any dish inspired by this era. Your participation enriches our community and helps us decide which themes to explore next. And if this documentary brought something new to your knowledge, do not hesitate to like and share it with friends and family who also appreciate history and gastronomy. Together, we can keep alive the memories of those who came before us and whose creative solutions continue to teach us valuable lessons about resilience, sustainability, and the art of making much with little. Until the next journey through time.